Should. Kathleen's on the line in Birmingham. What do you think, Kathleen?
I think it's very important that the children do see their grandfather.
Yeah.
They get to know him, and he gets to know them. And when you're small, when they grow up and anything happens to Charles, please God, no, it's not going to, then there's going to be a lot of questions. Well, Mummy, Daddy, why didn't you take me to see him, and get to know him? I think it's good for children to get their royal, to have an extended family. Charles can play with them, and he gets to know them. Also, with Harry not having security, I would look underneath that. I think that even though they don't want Harry to have security, I think British intelligence, there'll be somebody working underneath all that to keep an eye on Harry. I don't think they're going to leave him in the wide open.
I don't suppose it's something, you're feeling that that's the case, Kathleen, and you may be right. You may be right. But I don't suppose that if you're Harry, you can put your personal safety in a feeling, just feeling that somebody might be looking after you. When you've been told by RAVEC, the authority that Afia's describing, that they're not going to pay for it, they're not going to provide it. I don't suppose you can just kind of assume they might really secretly do it, can you?
No. Going back to the children, very, very, very important. They're a family. Forget they're royal. They are a family, and it's very important. It's very important for the children to grow up knowing their grandparents or grandparents.
I couldn't agree with you more. And thank you so much for ringing, Kathleen. Let me just run this past Sophia. When Kathleen says so nicely and sweetly, forget they're royal, they're just a family. Do you think they ever can forget they're royal? Or do you think the kind of, as Callum was saying before, the protocol, the restrictions, the formality, the fact that they're observed every single second that they're out of the interior of whatever palace they're in, does that mean they can never, ever forget it, even when they're just together?
I think so, because you're always kind of in a fishbowl, aren't you? And you're always being observed. And I think also because there's so much mistrust with all of them, because they brief about each other all the time. So you're wondering, when you're sitting there at lunch and you drop something down your top, is it going to end up in the Sunday Times? Do you know what I mean? So I think there's probably an element of not really being able to forget that, not being able to really fully trust each other and relax.
Do you think, Callum, that there's a point at which everyone just has enough of this? They are coming, they're not coming, they are staying, they're not staying. There have to be people who don't do this for a living, just thinking, oh, make your mind up. And also kind of losing sort of sympathy for the family, just thinking, sort yourselves out,
I think, first of all, I think Kathleen's absolutely right. Kids, I don't think, should be told until they have told what to do in many ways, but until they have a way to figure it out themselves. So for now, while they're still young, you try to make the family work the best you can. When they get older, they'll figure it out themselves. But also, even now, knowing we have to talk on it, it's like, well, what do you say? But people feel really strong about this stuff.
Yeah, they do.
And I think the reason that it's reached this point is because there's been, mistrust and things have happened that weren't following the protocol. And I'm sure they don't want to, but when you're born into something like that, you don't know the difference. And you realize that is what your life is, and that's what you're going to have to follow. But I guess what's happened is they've tried to break free, and that's where this is all come from.
I reckon you have more empathy about this than lots of people, because you were born into effectively football royalty.
There you go.
You had no say in it. That's been your destiny.
And still get grief for it.
And still get grief for it. And still get stared at because of it, reported on because of it, looked at wherever you go, and all of that sort of stuff. And, you must have some understanding of the fact that you didn't ask for it.
Well, far from royalty, but like you said, footballing royalty, you're absolutely right. But for over the years, you kind of think, I suppose it comes from when the good things are said, it's always lovely. But when the grief comes, you go like, well, what did you want me to do? Like there was nothing. So I'd imagine he's thinking to himself. But then I think to myself, if he wants to go show up when he wants to, why shouldn't he be able to? It's part of his life. It's his how he was raised. It's what he is born into. Why couldn't he go rest his head at his home?
Exactly. All very difficult. The whole thing. I bet much more complicated than any of us really realizes. But anyway,
Squaddies, I need you to sit down for this one, because something happened on a British radio panel this week that I genuinely did not expect. And I've watched a lot of these panels. A caller from Birmingham, a radio host, 2 guests with zero obligation to defend Harry and Meghan. And by the end of the segment, without a single one of them setting out to do it, they had built the most complete, most human defence of Prince Harry's position I've heard in months. Not from a Sussex squad account, not from us, from ordinary people on a call-in show who owe this family nothing. It starts with a caller, a woman named Kathleen, phoning in from Birmingham. And what she said was so simple it almost sounds like it shouldn't need saying out loud, but apparently it does, because we're 4 years into a media narrative that has somehow avoided saying it. Children deserve to know their grandparents. That's it. That's the whole point. Not titles, not protocol, not who curtsied to who at Christmas. Just a boy and a girl growing up in California who deserve a relationship with the man who is their grandfather, regardless of what crown he wears or what column inches have been spent picking apart his son's marriage. And here's why this lands so hard, squaddies. Every time this story gets reduced to a scoreboard, who snubbed who didn't get invited where, who's finally speaking to who, it erases the 2 kids sitting in the middle of it who did not choose 1 second of this. Archie and Lilibet didn't choose the RAVEC ruling. They didn't choose the tabloid war. They didn't choose 4 years without a relationship with their grandfather. Kathleen cutting straight through the noise to say, forget the royal politics, this is a family, is exactly the kind of clarity this conversation has been starving for. Because so much of the criticism aimed at Harry and Meghan over the years has come from people who conveniently forgot that basic fact, or never wanted to remember it in the first place. It's easier to talk about duty than it is to talk about 2 small children who spent years without their grandfather. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the conversation shifts to security. And this is where I think the panel, without meaning to, ends up making Harry's argument for him in real time. Kathleen floats an idea a lot of well-meaning people float. Maybe there's some quiet behind-the-scenes arrangement. Maybe British intelligence is keeping an unofficial eye on him. Maybe the system wouldn't really leave him exposed. I get the instinct. It's comforting to believe the machinery wouldn't actually let a former working royal walk around unprotected. But one of the panelists pushes back on that, and I want you to really sit with what she says, because it's the entire ball game. You cannot ask a father to bet his family's safety on a feeling. You cannot ask a man to gamble his children's lives on the hope that someone, somewhere, might quietly be looking out for him off the books. That's not paranoia. That is basic responsibility. This is a man who watched the press and the institution fail to protect his mother. He is not going to roll the dice on his own children based on an assumption. When RAVEC formally told him funded protection was off the table, that wasn't some bureaucratic footnote he could shrug off. That was a documented, real decision with real, lasting consequences. And it's genuinely telling, squaddies, that even a caller who clearly wants to see this family reconciled instinctively reaches for, well, maybe he's secretly protected anyway. Because deep down, people know the alternative sounds indefensible. If you strip a working royal father of standard protection and then act shocked that he's cautious about bringing his children into the country, you don't get to also act shocked that visits are rare. You made them rare. That's not on Harry. That's on the system that made the decision. Then the conversation goes somewhere I think is the actual emotional core of this entire saga, the fishbowl. The question on the table is simple. Can this family ever really switch off? Even in private? Even together behind closed doors? And the answer from one of the panelists is sharp, and it should be a headline on its own. You are always being observed. There is so much internal mistrust built up over years of family members briefing against each other to the press that something as small and human as spilling a drink at lunch becomes a genuine risk of turning up in a Sunday tabloid by the following weekend. I want you to actually sit with that for a second, squaddies, because that is not a throwaway line. That sentence is, word for word, the exact environment Harry and Meghan said they were escaping when they stepped back in 2020. People spent years mocking that decision, calling it ungrateful, calling it dramatic, calling it a betrayal of duty. And here is a panelist with no allegiance to the Sussexes whatsoever, independently describing the identical suffocating dynamic, the surveillance, the internal paranoia, the inability to just exist as a family without wondering who's going to leak what to which Royal Rota reporter by Friday. That's not Meghan being difficult. That's not Harry being ungrateful. That is a documented, lived reality inside that institution, described from the outside by someone with nothing to gain from defending the Sussexes. When your own family's internal culture runs on distrust and tabloid leverage, walking away from it isn't betrayal, it's self-preservation. Full stop. And then we get what I think is genuinely the most moving section of the whole segment. Callum Best. Callum isn't a royal commentator. He's not paid to have an opinion on the Sussexes, but he grew up under his own brutal, relentless version of public scrutiny as George Best's son, and what he brings to this conversation is something none of the professional royal watchers can offer: actual lived recognition. He says, in his own words, that he has real empathy for people who never asked for the spotlight they were born into and who still get picked apart for a life they didn't choose. He makes the simple point that if Harry wants to go be with his family on his own terms, in his own home, why shouldn't he be allowed to? That's his life. That's what he was raised in. That's not fandom talking squaddies. That's recognition. One person who's lived under a public microscope extending grace to another person living under an even bigger one. And honestly, I'd take that over a dozen royal historians with theories about protocol any day of the week. The host then asks the question that is, in my opinion, the actual crux of this entire ongoing saga. Does the public eventually just get tired of the back and forth? Are they coming? Are they not coming? Are they staying? Are they not staying? Does the audience just run out of patience? And Callum's answer is more generous than I expected. He says Kathleen had it right from the very start. Kids shouldn't be told what to think about any of this. They should be given the space to work it out for themselves as they grow up. In the meantime, the job of the adults is simply to make the family work as best they can. No grand statements, no ultimatums, no choosing sides for a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old before they're even old enough to understand what any of it means. Just keep showing up. Keep trying. Let the kids decide later who they want in their lives and how. That, squaddies, is exactly the approach Harry and Meghan have quietly been taking, even while the tabloid machine wanted a cleaner, more dramatic story to sell papers with. And that brings us to the moment that actually happened, the reason this whole conversation is even on the table: the Highgrove visit. Nobody involved needed a grand public reconciliation tour with photographers lined up along the driveway. Buckingham Palace confirmed the visit took place, confirmed it was private, and released no pictures. That's not a couple performing forgiveness for the cameras. That's a family quietly letting 2 small children get to know their grandfather on terms that protect them instead of exploiting them. If you've listened to anything Harry has said publicly over the past several years about wanting a gentler, more protected relationship between his own children and the press than he ever had, this is exactly what that looks like in practice. Low-key, private, no spectacle, just Archie and Lilibet, finally sitting with their grandfather for the first time in 4 years. And here's the piece that really lands, squaddies. Callum talks about growing up as, in his words, football royalty, and how even now, decades later, When good things are said about him, it's lovely. But the second criticism lands, the reflex from everyone else is always, "Well, what did you want me to do? I didn't ask for any of this." That is such a precise description of what Harry has been saying in different words for a decade. Nobody consults you before you're born into a role like that. You don't get a say in the surveillance, the formality, the constant observation. You just inherit it. And then, when you finally try to set boundaries around it, when you say, "I need distance, I need to protect my wife, I need to protect my children from what happened to my mother," you get accused of abandoning a birthright you never asked to carry in the first place. Callum's closing point might be the strongest moment in the entire segment. If Harry wants to come back on his own terms, at his own pace, to rest his head in the country he was born in, there is no good reason he shouldn't be allowed to do exactly that. It's his life. It's what he was raised in. Nobody else gets to dictate the shape of his relationship with his own family. The host closes the segment by admitting something refreshingly honest, that the whole situation is almost certainly far messier behind closed doors than anyone on the outside, including a radio panel, could ever really know. And I actually respect that admission, squaddies, because so much of the commentary around Harry and Meghan pretends to have perfect insight into private family dynamics that literally none of us are privy to. This panel, to its credit, mostly avoided that trap. Nobody on that call was trying to score points against Harry and Meghan. A caller from Birmingham gently and sincerely argued that children deserve their grandfather. A host correctly pushed back on the idea that Harry should have to gamble his family's safety on a hopeful assumption. A panelist with no Sussex-specific agenda whatsoever described precisely the surveillance and internal mistrust culture Harry and Meghan have said for years they were trying to escape. And another panelist, speaking from his own painful experience with inherited public scrutiny, made the simple, humane case that a grown man should be allowed to go be with his family without needing anyone else's permission slip. Put all of that together, squaddies, and what you get isn't a panel of Sussex superfans defending Harry and Meghan out of loyalty. What you get is a handful of ordinary, thoughtful people, independently landing on the exact same conclusions Harry and Meghan have been trying to explain since 2020. That the environment they left was genuinely suffocating. That the security decision made against Harry was genuinely reckless. That children deserve relationships with their grandparents that aren't dictated by tabloid politics. And that at some point a grown man with a family of his own gets to decide what his life looks like, regardless of the title attached to his name. I don't think that's a controversial take. I think it's just what happens when people actually listen to the details instead of the headline. And that's exactly why the Highgrove reunion matters so much. It is proof that Harry and Meghan were never trying to sever this family completely. They were trying to build a version of it that doesn't come at the cost of their children's safety, their marriage, or their peace of mind. Archie and Lilibet finally sitting with their grandfather isn't a contradiction of everything the Sussexes have said for the last several years. It is the actual point of what they've been asking for the whole time. A family on healthier terms. Not no family at all. So here's what I want to know from you. This channel only works if it's a conversation and not just me talking into a microphone for 20 minutes. Do you think Kathleen was right? That no matter what title a child is born into, the most important thing is simply knowing their grandparents, full stop? Or is there more nuance there, given everything this family has been through? Do you agree that Harry can't reasonably be expected to rely on some quiet, unofficial safety net instead of real, funded protection? Or do you think the RAVEC decision was fair? And what did you make of Callum's comparison? The idea that growing up under intense inherited scrutiny, royal or otherwise, gives you a kind of empathy that a lot of outside commentators simply don't have. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the best conversations on this channel have started because someone down there disagreed with me. So don't hold back. If this one gave you something to think about, do me a favor. Hit like and send it to one person who still doesn't quite get why Harry and Meghan made the choices they made. The more people who hear the full context instead of the 3-second clip, the better this conversation gets for everyone. And if you're new here, subscribe. This channel exists to cut through the tabloid noise and actually look at the receipts week after week. There's a lot more where this came from. Thanks for being here, squaddies. I'll see you in the next one.